How often have you felt restricted to spiritual practices that often seem outdated and of little relevance in today's world? Are you discouraged to express your own creative talents and develop spiritual practices that are uniquely you? The Liturgical Rebels podcast is for people like you who want to reimagine and reconstruct their faith and spiritual practices. It's for those who want to reshape belief and journey closer to God's wholeness with peace, justice, and flourishing, not just for themselves, but for the earth and all its inhabitants. Today, I will be in conversation with Tony Jones, the author of The God of Wild Places, Rediscovering the Divine in the Untamed Outdoors. He is an award-winning outdoors writer and has also written a dozen books, including The Sacred Way, Spiritual Practices for Everyday Life. He also hosts the Reverend Hunter podcasts and teaches at Fuller Theological Seminary and the Loft Literary Center. He does writing retreats in Italy and guides canoe trips in the BWCA. Tony is married, has 3 children and 2 dogs, and lives in Edina, Minnesota. Tony, it's just a delight to have you on my podcast this morning. Thank you for taking this time to be with me.
Well, it's great to see you again, Christine, and I've been a big fan of your work for many, many years.
Thank you. Well, I figured out that I think Tom and I probably first met you in the 1990s, which of course dates all of us, when you were, of course, a part of the Emerging Church Network. And I know that your life has had many twists and turns since that time. And would you mind giving us just a little bit of a snapshot of that journey?
Yeah, sure. And the book recounts this, much more in depth. But I got out of seminary in the mid 1990s, did some work on a Native American reservation, and then got into what I assumed had been my life calling, which was to be a pastor. Mm-hmm. I was an associate pastor at a big church in Minnesota. That's probably where you and I met for the first time, when we were traveling some of the same circles.
Yes.
I had gone to Fuller Seminary, where I know that your work was being tracked by students there at the time in the 90s. And then, of course, in the youth ministry world, a lot of youth pastors were reading you guys. And then, of course, a lot of the emergent movement, as you remember, was made up of former youth pastors.
Yes.
We just didn't. There's so many streams that went into the emerging church, but I think one that probably tracks with what you and Tom have been doing and were doing at the time is, we were all doing youth ministry in the 90s, kind of in the wake of Mike Yaconelli and Youth Specialties. And I know I'm sure, you all spoke at those conferences back in the day?
Some of them.
Yes, of course. Yeah. And that was, what those folks did was really invent basically a kind of relational ministry, relational youth ministry, which was about meeting kids at their level, which everything down to like having a youth room at the church that was full of ratty old couches and,
Yes.
Christmas lights strung up from the ceiling and this kind of thing.
I still see churches that are like that, actually.
Well, and exactly. So then jump ahead a few years, and when former youth pastors like me and Doug Padgett and Mark Scandrette are starting churches, no surprise, those churches end up looking a lot like the youth lounges in the where we had served as youth pastors. We wanted a church experience that was more relational, and like the youth ministries we had run.
Yes.
not so formal
Mm-hmm.
as the traditional liturgical services. And we just, we were Gen Xers, and we're, in some ways it's funny because Gen Xers are kind of the forgotten generation, but we just didn't really feel like the people of our generation were that interested in transitioning from that very authentic, friendship-based relational youth ministry into sitting in a pew, listening to people talk and singing hymns facing all the same direction. So we started to upset even the inner architecture of church life and things like that. And so that was a big part of my life. Yes. So that's one track of my life.
Mm-hmm.
The other track of my life is that I was in a really destructive, toxic marriage
Mm-hmm.
that was killing me from the inside. So even while on the outside it looked like everything was bright and shiny and happy, there was a lot of distress and turmoil on the inside for me. There was a real struggle.
Which I think is so much, the case for so many people, so many church leaders. They kind of, we've learned to put on these masks that hide the inner struggles that we're going through, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, there's even a quote in my book from a psychological evaluation that I underwent as part of a custody evaluation during the divorce, in which the psychologist, he talked about me wearing masks,
Yes.
wearing a mask to hide a lot of inner doubt, self-doubt, which of course, yeah, like you say, I think a lot of preachers tend to do that. So ultimately, first in 2009, then even more in 2015 during a custody fight, my professional life really collapsed. In the words of one famous Christian author, Tony, she said, "You're radioactive." So a lot of
Wow.
my friends, a lot of my friends really abandoned me. Some didn't, but most of them did. I was, I lost my marriage. I ultimately won custody of my kids, but I financially was ruined, got foreclosed on, just it was hard time. And the church is often good at taking care of broken parishioners and not so good at taking care of broken pastors.
Definitely, yes.
Yeah. So I ended up, as I write about in the book, I ended up spending more and more time outdoors instead of inside churches.
And we'll get onto that in a moment, but I did want to ask you one personal question because, well, from my perspective anyway, like you, I am an Enneagram 8. And so I know some of the challenges that this can impose on our lives. And so I was wondering, what in a nutshell are the advantages and disadvantages, do you think, of being an Enneagram 8? I people say to me, yeah, you're not only an Enneagram 8, but you're also an Australian. So, and a woman, and all those challenges. But I know yours have been a bit different. But
mine's been different. I will just say this about, is that I think I have some friends, some women friends who are 8s, and I think it's particularly challenging to be a female 8 because I think 8 energy tends to feel, or the world perceives it as a masculine type of energy. And so when women come with that challenging type of energy, sometimes it's not received very well by other people. So I feel for you in that. But in general, I think it's been interesting, Christine, because a lot of the response I've gotten to the book in the 5 weeks it's been out now, people say, even my daughter called me. She's 22, 23, and she called me, "Dad, I can't believe you were this vulnerable. I've just never seen you this vulnerable."
Oh, it's an incredibly vulnerable book. I agree. I was amazed too.
I mean, imagine for her growing up with a dad who's an 8, very strong energy, very ambitious, driven, not just in my career, but of course in my parenting. I was always like really intense with my kids, and
Mhm.
they didn't see a lot of weakness in me. They didn't see me break down in tears
Mhm.
or things like that. They just didn't experience that. And then, from 2015 on, when I was raising them myself, they also didn't even have like a maternal,
Mm. Mhm.
motherly type person in their lives. So all they got was me,
Yes.
big Tony, loud Tony, etc. So I mean, the plus side, you sent me some photos from the Church Basement Roadshow in 2008, which is such a funny time, Christine, because it was the worst summer of my life. I mean, that's the summer my marriage came apart, and it was
That's
terrible.
I was just talking to Lisa Scandrette this morning, and she was telling
Mm,
me that was when everything fell apart.
that was.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
on the other hand, it was also the greatest summer of my life
Mm.
because Mark and Doug and I and Dave Laird went to 35 cities, jumped up on stage, performed this crazy, performance art piece to sell our books. And so the good part about being an 8 is being able to um, do that fun stuff with confidence. I'm a pretty good preacher. I'm not intimidated by crowds. I don't have a fear of public speaking. But I think that the other side of being an 8 is that then people assume, because of that 8 energy, that I'm really strong. I've got it all together. Nothing ever hurts me. I'm impervious to pain. Um, And of course, as you know, that's not true. So I think that accounts for the surprise that a lot of people have in the book. Like, wow, I didn't know you had a. My wife Courtney, she's like, well, I've always known you had a soft side, but that's just not how the world often perceives an 8. So
Yes.
that I think
No.
that's part of it.
It's interesting. I just got a phone call coming through from a good friend of mine who I understand is also a friend of Courtney's,
Mm,
Cheryl Mackey. And she's helped me understand what it means to be an Enneagram 8 and, kind of to help me a little just be more vulnerable on the softer side of things. And I think that
yeah.
is often the case. And you certainly are very vulnerable in your book, The God of Wild Places, Rediscovering the Divine in the Untamed Outdoors. Um, and I found it very moving. I laughed,
Thank you.
I cried as I read it. Um, and, but, I am particularly intrigued by your journey from church to wilderness as a place to interact with God. I mean, like you, I am attracted to the outdoors. I mean, um, my husband calls me the garden queen because I love to garden. I love to do, get out in nature. It doesn't matter what it is. And I just wanted, and in fact, probably 10 years or more ago now, I started asking people what makes you feel close to God. And I would say that 80% of them said something about nature. Rarely did people mention church.
Mm,
Um, and and I think that, I mean, now I wouldn't be surprised if it's even more, if it's even higher from that perspective. But and I just wanted to read a quote from your book here, um, and let's where you say. Um, Most of us don't quit church in a huff, storming out mid sermon, vowing never to return. Instead, we slide away, slowly attending less and less often until one day we're forced to admit, I don't go to church anymore. These days, us non churchgoers are the fastest growing segment of the American religious landscape. Maybe not coincidentally, the trend line of Americans' participation in outdoor activities is headed in the opposite direction, growing significantly over the past 15 years, which obviously is something that both of us have discovered. But being more specific, what are some of the ways in which you've connected to God in nature?
Yeah, I mean, I think the part of the reason for me that I felt pulled to the outdoors in the same way I felt pulled to the church when I was a kid, and then pulled to the outdoors as an adult, is because my life was not clean and neat.
Mm, mm,
Like and the church world that I came from, the Reformed tradition of Congregationalism, was very regularized, a very specific liturgy that was done the
mm-hmm.
same every week. The ministers, we wore black Geneva gowns. We preached 23-minute sermons. I didn't come from a hand-raising Pentecostal, like freewheeling kind of experience of Christianity. I came from a very regularized, patterned version of Christianity. And yet my life, my internal life, as I've already said, was a mess. It was not
Uh-huh.
regular. It was not at right angles. It did not, everything did not fit perfectly together. Things did not happen in 23 minutes,
Yes.
And when I went out into the wilderness, and yeah, I like you, I garden. I remember seeing your gardens when we were there in 2008, and I looking out my back door at 4 big raised garden beds. I've planted one. I kind of stagger the planting so we don't get all of our veggies the same week.
That's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I love that. I love the mess of it. I love, and I guess one of the big, and then as you know, I hunt a lot and I fish, but primarily I hunt, and I spend a lot of time in wild places hunting. Being more involved in the food that I eat, whether it's through gardening or through hunting, um, and getting my hands in the hummus. Look, whether it's our garden or whether it's field dressing a deer that I've just shot, my hands are in death,
Mm,
because the hummus in my garden is all composting dead
mm-hmm.
material. It used to be living, now it's dead, and then it's going to become living again. You
Yes.
know, and I don't know, you probably have this experience too, but I have 2 of those big roller compost bins,
Uh-huh.
and one is, I always tell Courtney, like, that's the one we're dumping stuff in, and then the other one we're letting finish so
Uh-huh.
that we can dump it. And then at the end of the winter here in Minnesota, it freezes up, and so then just last week, the one that had been from last summer we'd used, it's ready. And
Mm-hmm.
the satisfaction I feel at dumping that compost into the garden and scooping it out with my hands, all this formerly living
Mm-hmm. Yes.
material that we've eaten, and then the parts that we've discarded ends up as like dirt in my hands. One of my favorite days of the year is when I get to empty out the finished compost bin
Mm-hmm.
into the garden and see that formerly living material that has now become hummus and compost for my garden. And you can still see, you can still see an avocado pit or a bit of a banana. You see the sticker from the banana peel, but the banana
Yes.
peels, all those little things. I love that part. And that's like death. Those were living plants that we consumed, and then we discarded part of them, and then now they're compost, but now they're going to become living things again, because they're going to be absorbed into the new plants that are growing. And the same
Yes.
thing happens. I think it's the same process when I hunt,
Mm-hmm.
that I kill an animal
Mm,
that was once living, and I butcher it, and then I consume it. It becomes part of me. And then, honestly, someday I then will fall prey to
mm,
something, whether it's old age or getting hit by a bus or cancer or whatever. And then, I'll be back in the earth, and I'll be composted, and I will be dead and be made a new life in a
mm.
new being. Yeah. So,
Oh, the whole process of composting is just, to me, it was one of those incredible revelations of God to me. Firstly, how God can take the waste in our lives and make it into what a gardener calls black gold. But secondly, as you say, that introduction, that important introduction to the cycle of life. And of course, you do bring it in different ways. I'm not a hunter, and I have never considered hunting as part of, my exposure to the outdoors. And I did struggle with it a little bit. But again, but in your chapter 4 on companions, I just want to read a little bit out of this. And you're already kind of talking a little bit about that, but just to kind of, be a little more clear. Care for the rest of creation beyond our own species is a mark of our cultural evolution. Few of us think of the created order as a hierarchical chain these days. A web is a more apt metaphor. We are woven into a fabric of creation that includes everything from the largest mammal to the smallest cell. Everything in the fabric is interconnected to everything else. This is the hunter's paradox. I sing a paean to one animal, my dog, my companion, while I'm out to kill another, my prey. Why does one sleep next to my bed and the other wind up on my grill? And why do I get to decide their respective fates? Do you want to fill that out a bit for me?
Well, I mean, it's frankly the paradox of anybody who eats meat. But I think even vegetarians are not off the hook, because human beings, we're the most invasive species this planet has ever seen, and we extirpate critters.
Yes.
Where you're sitting in your house and where I'm sitting in my house 200 years ago, these were woods, and it was abounding with little critters, rabbits and mice and microbes and everything in between. And they're all gone now because we've plowed it flat and poured concrete foundations and built our own houses so that we can live and thrive in comfort. And so even if everybody on my block was a vegetarian, we'd still have pushed out a lot of critters and extirpated them from this environment. So it's just what human beings do. Whether we eat meat or not eat meat, we're responsible for the death of a lot of animals. And all I'm trying to do as a human being and as a thinker and a theologian is to try to come to terms with that and realize that I do make these relatively arbitrary decisions, that I'm not going to hunt and eat my dog, but I am going to hunt and eat a white-tailed deer, and I get that makes some people uncomfortable, but part of my journey has been, I just want to be more honest about the life I live. And I feel like when I was in ministry, I wasn't totally honest, because I was preaching peace and standing up in a pulpit and acting like I had everything together. But my personal life was not clean and neat. It was messy. And I felt dishonest. I knew I was being dishonest about it. And now I just want to be honest about the fact that I eat animal. I'm a carnivore. I eat meat. So I'm going to be honest about that. It might make my readers uncomfortable. I appreciate that you say it made you somewhat uncomfortable. You struggled with it. I think a lot of people do. But I also think we do a great disservice to the animals we eat when we buy them in a grocery store and never think about their death.
Oh, yeah.
Because our ancestors, all of whom ate meat, were deeply involved in the death of the animals they ate. Whether they were farmers 100 or 200 years ago, or whether they were hunters and gatherers 25,000 years ago, they were deeply involved in the death of the animals they ate. And I don't think they took it for granted because they were involved in it. And I think we do take it for granted, most of us, because we buy it at the grocery store wrapped in cellophane, and frankly, most of all that is denuded of blood.
Mm-hmm.
And as you and I both know, there's a lot of blood in the Bible. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And we make sure I don't want to see any blood on that boneless, skinless chicken breast I buy at the grocery store. But man, that chicken bled before it was wrapped
Yeah.
up in cellophane.
Well, when I was a kid, we used to keep chickens. And I do remember, kind of slaughtering the chickens, and also have been very much aware of the process and have no objection to it from that perspective. I think, and as I read your book, I mean, part of what I was really pleased to see was that you hunt and then eat what you hunt. Whereas, I think the kind of hunting I really struggle with is the kind of hunting where people, kind of devastate, and have in the past, of course, devastated and sometimes brought to extinction species because they've overhunted them. And, I don't know whether you have anything to say to that, that aspect of it.
Well, I don't trophy hunt. I mean, there are people who trophy hunt and just try to shoot the biggest, the animal with the biggest rack, so that
the most beautiful animal. Yes.
Yeah, the animal with the biggest rack on and hang it on the wall. That's not how I hunt. But in the United States, actually, we are so much. It's called the North American Conservation Model. And basically what we did is, in the early 20th century, we outlawed market hunting. And as a result, we still have wild animals on this continent.
Mm-hmm.
And in Europe, there's virtually none. There's virtually no deer. There's no more elk. I mean, there's little herds and little places that are protected. But there's Europe. I mean, there's like no public land to hunt. Everything is owned. You cannot, it's not even allowed to hunt. And as there's no hunting in Europe. People tell me that, like, because the gun laws and things like that. And I get it. I mean, the guns are another part of hunting that makes people uncomfortable. But the truth is, guns or no guns, there's no hunting in Europe because there's no public land and there's virtually no wild populations left because they were hunted to extinction. And in the U.S., to our credit, starting with people like Theodore Roosevelt, we hit the brakes hard on that before obviously we almost totally extirpated the bison, but that was one of the species that after that happened, a lot of American hunters and who led the conservation movement said, we're not going to do that anymore. We're not
Thank
going
goodness.
to.
Yes.
Yes. Thank goodness. We're not going to wipe species out anymore. So, I know what you're saying, but I will say on behalf of hunters, and I have a lot of hunters who are like me, pretty progressive, actually, politically and theologically progressive people. Hunters, for the most part, with some exceptions, are great conservationists and care a lot about wild land. I mean, it was just even what you said at the top of the interview about the people you talk to and how 80% of them find God in nature. Isn't it ironic, though, that we have less and less nature every year, and that we keep we're just mowing we're mowing down forests, we're building more malls and parking lots. It's a sad irony that as organized religion is dying before us and people are going to need wild places as spiritual escape, that we're going to have less and less of them.
Yes. Oh no, it's true. And I'm not saying I'm against hunting, because I think that allowing people to do that, I think, is a good idea in moderation. I think it's just because you can look back and see the devastation and the people that still want to be able to hunt with machine guns, and I mean, those kinds of fringe things, I know, that give hunting a bad name. And because I would, in many ways, agree with your perspective completely. I mean, one of the fortunate things about the US and also Australia, where I come from, is that because white settlement came so much later in the picture, we kind of woke up to ourselves a little more quickly in terms of the need for wild places, whereas Europe, of course, had
Yes.
thousands of years of moving in that direction. And of course, the kings and their entourages were well known for totally exterminating parks of deer and things
Yes.
like that,
Yes.
which,
Yeah.
is anyway.
And I just want to say a little shout out to Australia that among the best meat I've ever eaten is when Fuzz Kiddo cooked me kangaroo.
Oh, really? Uh-huh.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah. Kangaroo meat is good.
Really good.
And it's a shame that it's not more wildly eaten, because Australia could do with getting rid of a few kangaroos.
That's what I've heard. This is another, it's the same with white-tailed deer. Because we've extirpated almost all the predators of white-tailed deer, primarily wolves. The wolf population is a tiny fraction of what it was in North America. And as a result, wild deer populations have exploded, and that means more white-tailed deer illness. They spread these illnesses like chronic wasting disease. And so hunters actually help manage the populations of some of these prey species that don't have predators anymore because we've pushed out the predators, Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I was just at a conference, where they were talking about how one of the best things we can do to reestablish the balance is to bring back in the apex predators.
Yes.
And how, of course, the situation that started in Yellowstone with the wolves, and how it just kind of brought renewal at every level of the ecosystems. And I think that it's true, that we've often been very short-sighted in our way of looking at things, and learning a respect for all of the creatures, not just the pretty ones, not just the ones that we think aren't going to damage us or hurt us if we get too close, but learning to respect the creation as it is, I think, is a very important part of what we need to do. And of course, you do talk a bit about that and some of the risks that you've gone through, but it's just fascinating to me to see the direction that you've gone, because it's a different direction from that which a lot of other people that find God in the wild have gone into, and that's part of what I find fascinating. Are there what are the lessons that you've learned would you like to share with our readers? And anything else, any quotes you might want to give out of your book, The God of Wild Places, or lessons that you've learned as you wrote it?
Yeah, well, from having read the book that a big death is a big theme in the book, and not only death of my first marriage and kind of the spiritual death that ensued, but I write about the death, kind of the metaphorical death of a forest when a tornado ripped through a forest of our family land and knocked down all these gorgeous, huge, hundreds-year-old white pine trees and the scraggly aspen that grew up in their place. And then I'd write about the death of my father and coming to terms with that. So I just think a big thing for me, Christine, in the outdoors has been facing my own mortality, which honestly, as somebody who grew up Christian, with so much emphasis on going to heaven when you die, and your next life will be so much better than this life. That was the version of Christianity I grew up in. It was very otherworldly focused. And that I've been disabused of that notion, not only because I just theologically really have a hard time with it now, but also because there is another strain of Christianity. So a quote from the book that you might like, that you might remember is from a sign that hangs over the monastery on Mount Athos that says, "If you die before you die, then you won't die when you die," which is a funny, paradoxical kind of statement, but it's in line with the Stoic idea of memento mori. Remember your mortality. Keep
Hmm.
your death always before you, and you will live a better life. You will love people better. You'll treat others better. You'll
Yes.
be better to this earth if you keep your death in front of you at all times. And so I've really I don't our mutual friend Doug Paget used to talk about um getting rid of this notion of a God who was up and out. God was
Hmm.
always up and out,
Yes.
this sovereign immaterial spirit God. And instead, like, and that was such a big part of the Church Basement Roadshow that came through your hometown there. And these pictures from us sitting around having a potluck at your house was just
Yes.
brought back such great memories. And I sent it to Doug and Mark,
Oh,
and
good.
all those pictures, yes, and all three of us in those three books that we were promoting that summer were basically coming at it from different angles, saying the same thing. Stop thinking of the Christian faith as something that is an escape from this world and this life. You remember Mark's Soul Graffiti book.
Oh,
It was
yes.
these very gritty stories on the streets of San Francisco,
Yes.
and Doug's was about a spiritual formation in a community of Solomon's Porch that was so committed and loving to each other and feeding each other meals every Sunday, and writing their own music. And it was really about the here and now. And my book was about the whole emerging church movement, and about, I had this little spiel at the Church Basement Roadshow against Platonism and this dualism of, like, spirit is good and flesh is bad, and instead we're a mix. There's no
Mhm.
dualism. We're a mix
Well,
of
I like to say that
spirit and
all
body.
of creation is infused with the presence of God.
Mm-hmm.
That God is in everything and everywhere. And I'm more and more convinced of that. And I think that, I mean, when you read the Bible with that perspective, um, and with the perspective of God's interaction with the earth. I mean, what is the first thing that God does after creation? Plants a garden. Jesus is mistaken for the gardener because he's the gardener of the new creation.
Mm-hmm.
The city at the end of Revelation, it's a beautiful garden city. And I think, the whole thing of creation and God's love of creation is woven through the Bible, and somehow we've been taught to ignore it, and
Mm.
and
Yeah.
and that, I think, is one of the tragedies of evangelical Christianity.
Oh yeah. Oh no, I totally agree. So, uh, yeah, I think one of these things is like, I'm not any longer focused on what happens after I die.
Mhm,
I'm focused on what I can do now, here and now, and live the best life I can, and to keep my own mortality front and center at all times. Yeah.
mhm. Yep. I think that's a very good kind of philosophy and perspective on life. So, um, where can people first buy your book, The God of Wild Places? And secondly, what are the best ways for them to connect to you?
Well, if you just go to godofwildplaces.com, that will take you to my website, which will tell you all the different places you can buy the book. You can even buy one directly from me, and that I'll sign and mail to you. It's also available on audiobook on Audible and Spotify and all the audiobook outlets. So yeah, godofwildplaces.com, and my website at the bottom, it links right to my website, and that has all, like we all are. I'm on all the social medias, and it's no, if you want to get a hold of me, it's not hard. You can DM me on any social media. You can send me an email through my website. I've been getting hearing from old friends like you, and getting emails every day from people who've read the book and appreciate it has been. I've written a lot of books, as you know, and I've never had a book as warmly received as this one. So it's been 5 weeks of joy.
Oh,
since it
that's
came out.
wonderful. I'm so pleased, Doug.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Tony.
It's
And
all right.
just
Doug
to
and I were
finish up,
joined at the hip for many years,
I
so
know
it's
you were.
okay.
Yes.
It's all right.
Well, and you have a podcast of your own, don't you? Or maybe even more than one from what I
I
can
have two,
tell.
Christine,
Yeah,
and one
that's what
just
I thought.
ended yet. One just ended yesterday.
Uh-huh.
It's called Emerged.
Mm-hmm.
It's a retrospective of the emerging church movement. I don't know if you've listened, but you should definitely listen to the episode 10, which came out on May 6th. And Mark's in it, Doug's in it.
Lovely.
It's a beautiful episode of kind of how the movement ended, even how some of the churches closed. So it's a it's a tearjerker of an episode, but it's beautiful. And then I have my own podcast called The Reverend Hunter, where I talk to people about the spirituality of their outdoors pursuits.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah. So good. We need more of that kind of thing. So thank you so much, Tony, both for writing the book and for being willing to speak to me this morning
Oh, it's
or
been a
whatever
joy.
time.
Thanks
Yeah,
for having
it's
me.
been a
Thank
real
you.
delight. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
Today, I have been in conversation with Tony Jones about his new book, The God of Wild Places. Tony shared his journey from being a pastor in the emerging church network to finding solace and connection with God in the wilderness. He emphasized the importance of nature in spiritual experiences and how it can be a place to interact with God. The conversation explored the paradox of hunting and eating animals and the role of hunting in conservation and the importance of respecting and caring for creation. We concluded with a discussion on mortality and the focus on living the best life in the present time. In the next episode of The Liturgical Rebels, together with Forrest Inslee, I will chat to author, speaker, and activist Brian McLaren about his new book, Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart, and about its profound implications for how we live and love in the face of the extreme environmental and social changes facing our planet. I am Christine Syne, author of The Gift of Wonder and facilitator of the God Space Light website. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the podcast or follow me on Instagram, Facebook, or Substack.